Okay, folks, welcome back to Sander Hicks's YouTube channel and welcome to our latest interview. I'm very happy to welcome to our show here Ms. Alison Weir. Welcome, Alison. Thank you for being on our show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Alison, you're the author of an important new book that is titled Against Our Better Judgment. It tells the history of the founding of the Israeli state. And why don't you give us a little bit about your background and how you came to write this book?
Sure. Well, I guess 16 years ago, like most Americans, I didn't know much about Israel-Palestine, especially at that time. There's more attention, I'd say, paid today, but very few people knew very much about it. I started to pay attention at that time because it was the Second Intifada, suddenly was in the news. And I got curious about the news and started following it. My background is journalism. So I pretty quickly noticed how one-sided the coverage was. I started going on the internet to see what I could find.
And you were the editor of a weekly newspaper at the time?
That's right. I was the editor of a little weekly newspaper, small town in Northern California. So this wasn't for my job. It was just curiosity because I'd never looked into the issue before. And when I started to look into it on the internet just to see what was going on then, I found excellent media coverage from Palestinian media and Israeli media and some human rights groups that were there. Started following it, was shocked at how bad it was, how covered up it was by the San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Times, NPR, the left. I was thinking had been covering it up for many years. So I finally thought it was so important I quit my job and I traveled over to Gaza and the West Bank as a freelance reporter, just right in the middle of the violence of the second uprising.
And what did you see when you traveled there? How long were you there?
I was there about 3 months, and I saw entire neighborhoods that were being shelled by Israeli forces every night, especially in Gaza. Entire neighborhoods were bullet riddled. Homes were literally in ruins. I saw children who had been shot, quite a few. And, I just saw a level of violence against the Palestinian population that almost no one seemed to know was going on. And this was before any rockets had been fired. It was also before Hamas was elected. This was what was going on. I was there in very early 2001, quite a few months before 9/11. It was mainly February and March.
I think a lot of people are going to be hearing about you for the first time through this video. So give us your religious and political background. Where are you from? Where were you raised?
Sure. My father was in the military, so I was raised all over. We moved every few years, mostly on the East Coast and Midwest, although I've lived most of my adult life in the San Francisco area. My background is Protestant Christian. In college, I became very active in the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War.
Good.
Also was active in the civil rights movement.
Oh, excellent.
Is very much a quote student radical in Ann Arbor.
Ann Arbor, the site of the Port Huron statement, right?
I was on the Michigan Daily,
Wow.
where Tom had been the editor of the Michigan Daily.
That's great. So you have some new left credibility.
Oh, I was in the middle of it.
Wow.
Then I was in the Peace Corps in Afghanistan.
So hold on one second. Just for not everybody knows, not everybody is as erudite in the late 60s New Left. So the Port Huron statement was when there was SDS got together and basically redefined the kind of a new vision of the working class, really, for the New Left in the late 60s, and that it wasn't just the industrial factory workers, reading their Trotsky, but it could be white collar and blue collar and academics and public service workers. So it was, I think, a very revolutionary concept to expand the idea of the working class, and it could be students, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
So
Ann Arbor was really very much at the center of student activism. Ann Arbor, Berkeley, a few other places, of course, Madison, and Being on the student newspaper, we were sort of in the middle of all of that. I went down to the sanitation marchers, workers' march just a few days before Martin Luther King was killed.
Right.
We joined that march and went back to an activist church in Memphis, Tennessee. So then after college, I was in the Peace Corps in Afghanistan. After that...
What year was that? What year were you in Afghanistan?
69 to 71.
Oh, wow. Okay, great.
Mm-hmm. In the northeastern corner, in a very remote part. Then after that, went out to San Francisco to help start a radical counterculture publication called Sundance. It was sort of going to be a cross between Rolling Stone and Ramparts. At that time, there was sort of the political left and the cultural left, and this was going to include both.
That's great. Well, that's interesting. You're not a neo-Nazi white supremacist. You're not taking on Israel because you hate the Jews.
No, people that are trying to push that obviously don't know my background and think they can get away with it, right, because I don't play up that background. I'm trying to reach everybody, and I don't like being labeled or having other people labeled.
It's useful to say what you're not, and to say, and I think to reach a lot of people, to say that you're not doing mm-hmm. this out of hatred for the Jewish people, right? And what's your opinion of the Holocaust, for example?
I don't happen to be Jewish, but my father's family was Catholic, Polish. And one of my father's relatives, I think a cousin, I never saw this, but my aunt told me about it, had a tattoo from the Nazis. So like everybody, this was a...
Catholics, Gypsies, and Jews, and homosexuals were all in the camps.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Good. So that's good. 'Cause we met in Tehran, Iran, and it was a good conference. It wasn't a perfect conference, of course, in this perfect world, but I felt a little bit like if I knew that Holocaust denial people were going to be imported with us to this conference, I think it would have been nice if they would have let us know, because it's good to it's good to realize you don't have total control over the world, but the people that were there that were Holocaust deniers, I didn't find that they actually had that much to teach me. That they didn't seem to be making a lot of sense, and so they certainly didn't convert me to be a Holocaust denier. But let's move on. Let's go talk more about your book and Israel today. There's a lot to talk about with Trump, with the immigration ban. There seems to be a lot of Islamophobia. I know this is not much of a question, so where do you want to take it next? And then I'll ask you a better question after you say something.
That's a good question. Well, I guess I guess just continuing from your last question, when I came back from that trip, which was, as you can imagine, was, just incredibly intense, seeing what was really being done to Palestinians, seeing children who'd been shot, etc.
Oh, you're talking about the Israel trip.
That's right. That's okay. Right. We're going back now to 2001, early 2001. So when I came back, that trip changed my life, not surprisingly, I guess, that kind of trip. So at that point, I decided that I was going to do something about it. And I started the organization If Americans Knew, intentionally creating an organization that would be sort of journalistic. My goal was just to get the facts out to every single American I possibly could. Not to be labeled as the left wing, or, it would have been laughable to be labeled right wing, but, to just basically get the facts out to the general public, the American public, because I was very aware that it's the U.S. that is propping up Israel, that this is where the power is to bring change. So my view is I believe in grassroots, that the way to bring change is to get this out to the people, as we used to say. We used to say power to the people, and I still believe in that. Right.
And I totally understand not wanting to be pigeonholed, and you'd never want to give them a reason to say no. I know this in being a small businessman and being in sales, don't give them a reason to say no. So When I'm selling a loft bed job at my contracting business, I don't start talking about Building 7.
Yeah. You don't want somebody to decide already that they don't believe, they don't agree with you even before they've heard you say anything.
Right. You want to be able to make your case. And here in New York, oftentimes the conversation blows up if you try to get into a dialogue about certain political topics like Building 7. But anyway, so good. What are your thoughts on the recent Palestinian Intifada anniversary conference that we just attended together in Tehran, Iran?
Well, it was interesting to see that, people from around the world had come to that, from, parliament members from numerous countries around the world, some from Europe. Certainly we met people from Ireland, for example, from different countries in Africa, from Central and South America, that, this is clearly an issue that's understood around the world, and many governments are not afraid to speak out about it. In the United States, as we know, any politician would have been terrified to attend a conference like that, even if they support Palestinian human rights to a small degree. They just wouldn't go to something like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. It is. Well, why is that?
The Israel lobby. That's the big elephant in the room. The Israel lobby is very powerful, just like there are lots of powerful lobbies in Washington, D.C. As I understand you grew up in Washington.
I grew up in the area, right around there, the suburbs.
Oh, okay.
I'd like to say I'm from D.C., but really I'm from the Northern Virginia suburbs of D.C. But I spent a lot of time at punk shows in D.C.
So, it's again, after I came back from Gaza and the West Bank, I was looking at, well, how do you bring change? And to bring change, you have to understand, well, where, what's the map look like? What's the terrain? Where's the power? Why do we have this policy? What do people think? And I started reading and researching at that time. So this is now 16 years worth of research and several bookcases full of books on this issue. And during that time, I was learning not only about the history of the region, but I was learning about the U.S. relationship to Israel, starting back in the late 1800s. And a few years ago, I realized that because of all my reading, and because I had started in late, not somebody who's Palestinian American who's grown up knowing this issue, I was starting from scratch, trying to learn about it. And I found that I had discovered lots of information about the U.S.-Israel relationship that almost nobody else seemed to know. And finally, I decided I needed to write that down and get it on the internet, because if it's not on the internet, it doesn't exist. Right. And if it's out of print books, as it was, it won't exist for people. So I started writing what I hoped would be an article on it. And there was so much that, of course, it ended up being a book.
And did you try to get that book published? How did that go?
By that point, I was aware enough of the obstacles to getting things published on Palestine that I didn't waste the time trying to get it published. It's possible I might have. I think it's very unlikely. There are many excellent books that have been published, mostly in the past, but even still. So it's not entirely impossible, but especially with my subject matter, I felt it was so unlikely. And even if it were published by some book publisher, chances are they would water it down or want to edit in ways I might not agree with. They would probably.
You're like Walt Whitman and Mark Twain, and you became an independent publisher, and you effectively self-published it with your. And how did it do?
We've sold almost 30,000 copies.
That's great. It's very impressive.
So I think so much better.
Yeah, so many books published every year. I know as an independent publisher in the past with a couple of different companies that I've done, that I know how difficult it is. So kudos to you to getting this book out despite the odds. 30,000 copies is nothing to sniff at. That's great.
Well, in fact, I think with a lot of nonfiction books, 5,000 is considered good. Yeah. So we're pretty excited.
Right. Right. So you've obviously struck a nerve. There's obviously a market for this material. So what's next for you? What's next for your? And tell us more about your organizations that you are the leader of.
Sure. Well, we're again, the challenge is just to get the information out to people. So we do lots of things. I speak around the country. There's, of course, from the beginning, there have been efforts to block my speeches. The first thing when you work on, you say the word Palestine or Palestinian, you're immediately called anti-Semitic. So, that's
tell us an anecdote, a telling anecdote about a time that your speech was blocked.
well. One of the most interesting is maybe a time when an effort was made to block it that failed. That's sort of exciting. It was I was going to be speaking in Greenwich, Connecticut, and at the public library there, I got a phone call just a few days before I was supposed to be speaking from the organizer there, who said they've canceled us. They canceled the speech. And I said, wait, this is a public library. They can't do that because they're publicly funded. I didn't know that for sure. I suspected that, and then I found out I was correct. So I said, no, they haven't. I'm coming and I'm going to give the speech. If I can't give it in the library, I'll give it in the parking lot. So we wrote a press release about it. I sent it to the media there in Greenwich, Connecticut. And wonderfully and surprisingly, it was covered. So it was front page news in the Greenwich newspaper, radio and TV were covering it. When I flew in, I went straight to the library. There was a camera crew there to cover this controversy over censorship. Now, a lot of places that wouldn't happen, but fortunately, Israel partisans, I guess, weren't in charge of those media. So, it was, of course, a significant local story, and it got covered that way. Because of that pressure, because the media covered it and the people in the town learned about it, the library and their library attorney told them that they couldn't block the speech because of the content. The speech ended up going forward, and instead of having it in the sort of smallish room that we had reserved, they gave us the large auditorium that held over 300 people.
Wow.
And it was standing room only 2 days in a row.
No kidding. So you packed the place.
Yeah. And in fact, the New York Times even covered it. And the New York Times, I remember, wrote that, this is a pretty close quote, said something like, at the end of the speech, there was thunderous applause and a feeling that something had been said that needed to be said.
I saw that on your website. I thought that was one heck of a pull quote.
Yeah.
In journalism, that you run the pull quote as in big type in the middle of the article. So that's
right.
Great
Yeah,
pull
exactly.
Quote there, yeah. Well, that's good. Let's talk a little bit about Donald Trump, his ambassador appointee, David Friedman, to Israel, just passed the subcommittee approval in the Senate, is now going to get fully approved, most likely, by the full Senate in a matter of weeks or two. This guy is Trump's bankruptcy lawyer. Did you know this? David Friedman, they met when Trump needed a good bankruptcy lawyer, and David Friedman, who looks very lawyerly, he's rather rotund, and anyway.
But it's funny.
That's how they met. Go ahead. Go ahead. David Friedman, go.
I noticed that because I also had noticed he was a bankruptcy lawyer. And what struck me is this is quite different, but Israel attacked a U.S. Navy ship in 1967, the USS Liberty.
Right,
This is one of the big cover-ups.
Yeah.
They tried to sink the ship. They killed 34 Americans. They injured over 170 of them. And they've largely covered it up ever since. But because the surviving crew members and the families kept it alive, and one crew member, James Ennis, wrote an excellent book that exposed the whole thing. So eventually, Israel had to come out. They hoped they would just bury it. Usually that's what they do. But in this case, awareness grew over the years to a degree. So they finally had to come out with another book to counter it. And the book was written by a bankruptcy lawyer named Jay Crystal. So,
so that's the tie-in there.
Actually, yeah.
Right. But it's funny what's going on in this country. I mean, the Washington Post now has a motto on every issue of their paper and on their website that says, "Democracy dies in darkness." People in the what used to be the very centrist media have become very, very frightened, I think, of Trump. And there was an article recently. Kat McGuire sent me a link to the Intercept talking about how a terrorist attack would benefit Trump and would not. It would be something that he would play into quite well. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of Islamophobia right now. We've never seen this level of Islamophobia, this anti-Islamic targeting with the immigration ban, and then with the controversy in the courts about are the courts going to fight Trump successfully regarding his immigration policies? So how does this tie into David Friedman and what seems to be a very, very pro-Israel stance from the Trump administration?
Well, it's actually quite a bit more complicated than that. I mean, Trump is the antithesis of the kind of person I would want to be an American leader or president on every level. On every level, it shocked me to see someone like that. However, the surprising thing is that I haven't followed his domestic policies. So those I know nothing about. I focus on international relations, especially the Middle East. And on Israel-Palestine, despite the nomination of such an abysmal person to be an ambassador, his policies have been very similar to Obama's policies. The same people are, except for a few people at the top, the same people are in place. If you read the Israeli media, which covers it much better than the Washington Post, the Israeli media and some other similar publications have been writing about how Trump is basically the same as Obama so far. His verbalization is different. He sounds very pro-Israel. Of course, Obama's first speech when he was nominated was to AIPAC. So again, the liberal media play some things up and play other things down, just like the conservative media do. But the fact is that he said he was going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. This was a big deal. Obama had said the same thing. Obama didn't do it. It looks like Trump's not going to do it either. Trump, in the conversations with Netanyahu, again, as the Israeli media are reporting them, has been talking about the settlements and stopping the settlements, which is the same type of thing Obama said. So at that level, I'm not seeing the difference that people think is going on. What is startling about Obama, and very interesting, is that he was attacked from the beginning. I mean, sorry, I'm talking about Trump now, although this could fit Obama too, but certainly Trump has been attacked by the establishment. And by that, I mean both the left establishment and the right establishment. The Democratic Party, of course, is hugely against Trump and wants to blame Trump for Hillary losing the election, when most of us feel it was because of Hillary that they lost the election, that most of us wanted Sanders. But they want to blame Trump for it. And the Republican establishment was also against Trump. He was not their candidate. Their candidate was Ted Cruz or somebody like that, or Kasich they tried to come up with. So it's an unusual situation. And again, to understand what's going on, I would really recommend a website called Consortium News.
Oh, yeah, Robert Perry's site, sure.
Very strong site, and it's been covering this very well. I think people...
They did a great story recently, the top 5 myths about Iran.
Yeah.
I saw that, yeah. Tell us more about this recent UN report. You were talking about the UN accusing Israel of apartheid.
Yes, this was... of course, anybody that studied Israel knows it's practicing apartheid. Desmond Tutu said that, who's the bishop from South Africa, who, was a South African opposing apartheid, has said it. Many South African activists have said that what Israel is doing is apartheid. In fact, some of them say it's even worse than what
President Carter's book mentioned apartheid in regards to Israel. That was very controversial of him, and some people say it's the best part of that book.
Yes. So now the UN, an agency in the UN, issued a report, a long scholarly report. We have it on our website, where they found evidence that yes, indeed, Israel is practicing apartheid. So then the Secretary General, Guterres, I believe is his name, was under so much pressure from Israel and the U.S. that he forced the agency to withdraw the report. The woman who was in charge of that agency, and I don't remember, it's a long name, I don't remember the name of the agency, but the woman in charge of it is a very principled person named Rima Halaf, I think is her last name, resigned in protest, a very dignified resignation letter describing the pressure that the UN is under. And in her letter, she says that the overwhelming crises that are besetting the Middle East are because of a stream of injustices that have been plastered over, ignored, or endorsed by powerful countries. Everybody should read her letter. So that's been big news for those of us that follow the Palestinian issue. At first it was very exciting news to see this official report documenting this reality so effectively, and then to see it, of course, being quashed the way it usually happens.
And you yourself, sorry, can I interject for a second? You obviously are a big supporter of the people of Palestine, but are your relationships to those people stymied by your inability to get into Palestine?
Well, I think they will be. One time, quite a few years ago, I was stopped at Ben Gurion Airport, put into detention cell, held for 28 hours, and then expelled. And they said I would never be allowed into Israel, even though I didn't want to go to Israel. I was going to the Palestinian territories. But after that time, I did get in a few times. I didn't go through Ben Gurion. I went through the other entrances, but I was able to get in. Jordan and through Egypt. Uh-huh. Now that Israel has passed this, recently passed a law saying that anybody that supports boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, which is what pretty much all principled people do.
Right, BDS. The Green Party supported BDS as a party, actually. Yeah.
That's right. That would prevent me from getting in, if they enforce that law against me. You never know with Israel, all these years, you never know if you'll get in or not. They have complete power over whether or not you get into to Palestine. And this is, I think maybe you read, I just wrote an article about this, because what I think a lot of Americans don't realize is that a lot of people know, okay, Gaza is called the largest concentration camp on earth because it largely is. But it's not just Gaza. The occupied territories, which is the West Bank and Gaza, entrance and exit are completely controlled by Israel. That is a prison. People that live in the West Bank, that live in Bethlehem or Ramallah or Hebron or Jenin or Nablus or in Gaza City or Rafah, all of these human beings cannot leave their country to go to another country, to get a scholarship, to travel. It's impossible for them to leave unless Israeli armed guards let them out. And then when they want to go back, they cannot get back to their home unless Israeli armed guards let them back in. If I want to visit them, if I want to travel over there as a journalist or visit friends, if you wanted to go over maybe as a tourist to see Bethlehem, the same would apply to you. It wouldn't be Palestinian, border guards that decide whether or not somebody gets into their country the way it is in the U.S. It would be this hostile nation, Israel, that holds the keys to people getting in and out of the Palestinian territories.
So some of the Americans that were with us recently in Tehran, they were very hardline and said Israel does not have a right to exist. But then I talked to the great humanitarian spiritual filmmaker from Iran, Haj Nader Talebzadeh. I said, does Israel have a right to exist? He says, of course they do. And, he talked about the archaeological evidence that for the crossing of the Red Sea and Moses and the Exodus and all of that deep, deep stuff I learned about in Catholic school. So I want to ask you, as one of our final questions is, does Israel have the right to exist? And what is the solution going forward?
Well, when it's a very interesting phrase. Israel is wonderful at its propaganda machine. So we don't talk about any other country on earth having a, quote, right to exist. Yugoslavia is no longer there. Czechoslovakia is no longer there. The Belgian Congo has, now has a new name. So just in my lifetime, if I were more aware, I could probably name half a dozen other countries at least, actually easily. So in my own lifetime, a number of nation states have come and gone. We don't talk about nation states having a right to exist. Human beings have rights. Human beings have the right to exist. So when we're talking about Israel's alleged right to exist, what that means is that supposedly it had the right to ethnically cleanse at least 750,000 men, women, and children, maybe as many as 1 million, that somehow it had the right to do that. That's saying they had the right to steal that land and then rename it Israel. People that are saying it has the right to exist are saying it has the right to discriminate against people based on ethnicity, that some people are have fewer rights than others because they're of the wrong religious ethnicity. I don't acknowledge those rights. I don't think Israel had the right to expel people. I don't think any country has the right to ethnically cleanse other people. I don't think any entity has the right to steal people's homes and lands.
So, Alison, what can we do for peace in the Middle East?
I think what we can do is tell everybody else the facts, especially tell people like me that used to think I had nothing to do with this issue. It was just one of many complicated issues. I was focused on maybe U.S. policies at home, etc. But people need to know that the American population is responsible for what Israel does, because we give Israel over $10 million per day, year after year after year.
That's amazing. That's an amazing stat. 10 million a day.
It is, and it's on average per capita, we give Israelis 7,000 times more than to other people around the world. So we are central to what Israel does, and the rest of the world knows that, especially people in the Middle East are very aware that the U.S. is funding Israel.
We just approved 38 billion more over the next 6 years.
Next 10 years.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Great.
Well, it was approved and it'll go into effect next year. So it's up to us, the general population, to pay attention to this issue and tell our elected representatives that we don't approve these policies. Because until we do that, the policies will continue. And the time I've worked on this, which is now, I guess, about 16 years, everything has gotten much worse. The crises in Syria, the war against Iraq that just, produced massive carnage and tragedy, the devastation throughout the Middle East, is rooted in this injustice in Palestine. And until we focus on that issue and do something about it, it will continue to get worse.
My guest this evening is Alison Weir. She is the author of a great book that I've actually read cover to cover, people. It's called Against Our Better Judgment. It's all about the creation of Israel. Before I let you go, I have to ask you, I'm also an author and I've looked a little bit into that 9/11 thing. After Tehran, there was so much interest in the Zionist connection to the 9/11 attacks. So pardon my indulgence if I ask you, do you know about the 5 dancing Israelis? I was surprised to find out in my Tehran trip research that there's actually an FBI report and there's a high level of journalistic integrity to this story. So do you know anything about it?
Oh, yes. I remember learning about them early on. There was a lot of Israeli spying that had been going on just before that time that had come. Again, those of us focusing on this issue were very aware of a number of articles, including in some mainstream media, about Israeli art students, etc. Right. The 5, quote, dancing Israelis were arrested and eventually, I think, under Chertoff, they were sent to Israel. So there's a lot there that people should investigate.
There was the art students' espionage ring from Mossad in Florida, and then there were also people that were accused of being Mossad agents, and they probably were. But they weren't art students; they were the movers in New Jersey. Just to kind of let you know.
And in a few other places too. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So, Anyway, this has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and my audience.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks a lot, Alison. Good night.
Good night.